The wind screamed through the pines of Montana, sharp and bitter, carrying the kind of cold that sank into your bones and stayed there. Clara Hayes pulled her worn leather jacket tighter, her boots crunching deep into the snow as she trudged through the forest. At 24, she was lean and tough, her dark hair tied back in a messy braid under a fur-lined cap. A bow hung over her shoulder, a hunting knife strapped to her hip. She was a hunter, born and raised in these mountains. She lived with her Uncle Henry in a small cabin, scraping by on what she could trap or shoot, trading pelts for flour and salt at the nearest town. It wasn't an easy life, but it was hers, and she wouldn't trade the wild freedom of this place for anything. That day, she'd wandered farther than usual, tracking a deer she'd spotted the week before. The sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of a blizzard. She could feel it in the air, the way the cold tightened around her like a fist. She adjusted her grip on the bow, her breath puffing out in little clouds, when something stopped her dead in her tracks. A sound, faint and ragged, cutting through the howl of the wind, a groan, low and pained. Clara froze, her heart kicking up a notch. "Who the hell's out here?" she muttered under her breath, her eyes scanning the trees. She took a cautious step forward, then another, following the sound. It came again, weaker this time, pulling her toward a snow-covered ridge at the foot of the mountain. And there, half buried under a drift, she saw him, a man, sprawled out like he'd been tossed there. Clara's stomach flipped as she hurried over, dropping to her knees beside him. She brushed the snow from his face, her fingers trembling just a little. He was pale, his dark hair matted with ice, lips tinged blue from the cold. His clothes were torn, a fancy suit, the kind you'd see in a city, not out here. Blood stained the snow under his arm, a deep gash slicing through his sleeve. He wasn't moving, but a faint shudder of breath told her he was still alive. "Hey," she said, shaking his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. His head lolled to the side, his eyelids fluttering but not opening. Clara cursed under her breath. He was a dead weight, heavier than he looked, and the storm was closing in fast. She didn't know who he was or how he'd ended up here, but she couldn't leave him. Not out here, not like this. "You're not dying on me," she growled, hooking her arms under his shoulders. The wind clawed at her as she started dragging him, her boots slipping in the deep snow. He was tall, solid, and every step felt like hauling a sack of rocks. Her muscles burned, her breath came in sharp gasps, but she kept going, gritting her teeth against the cold, slicing through her jacket. The snow stung her face, sticking to her eyelashes, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. If she left him, he'd be a frozen corpse by morning, and she wasn't about to let that weigh on her conscience. The cabin wasn't far, just a mile, maybe less, but it felt like forever with the storm raging around her. The man groaned once, a weak sound that barely reached her over the wind, and it only made her move faster. By the time she saw the faint outline of the cabin through the white haze, her arms were shaking, her legs ready to give out. She stumbled to the door, kicking it open with her boot, and hauled him inside, collapsing onto the wooden floor beside him. The warmth of the fire hit her like a wave, a stark contrast to the icy hell outside. She dragged him closer to the hearth, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. He was still out cold, his face slack, his expensive clothes soaked and torn. Clara grabbed a blanket from the old trunk in the corner and threw it over him, then sank down beside him, watching the faint rise and fall of his chest. Her hands were raw from the cold, her jacket crusted with snow, but she didn't care. She'd gotten him here. Now she just had to figure out who he was and why the hell he'd been left to die in her mountains. The fire crackled in the small cabin, casting flickering shadows across the rough wooden walls. Clara knelt beside the stranger, her hands steady as she peeled back his torn sleeve to get a better look at the gash on his arm. It was deep, the edges jagged and red, but the bleeding had slowed, crusted over with ice and dirt. She grabbed a tin bowl from the shelf, filled it with warm water from the kettle, and started cleaning the wound, her movements quick and practiced. He didn't stir, not even a twitch, his face still pale under the faint glow of the flames. She didn't have a name for him yet, so in her head she started calling him John, just something to pin on him until he woke up and told her otherwise. He was older than her, maybe mid-30s, with sharp features and a jawline shadowed with stubble. His dark hair was a mess, but even half dead, he didn't look like he belonged here. His hands were too soft, no calluses or scars like hers, and that suit, ripped as it was, had the kind of stitching you didn't find in a general store. Clara frowned as she wrapped his arm with a strip of clean cloth, tying it tight. "What's a city boy like you doing out here?" she muttered, half to herself. The door banged open, letting in a gust of icy wind, and her Uncle Henry stepped inside, shaking snow from his gray beard. He was a wiry man, all sinew and bone, his face lined from years in these mountains. He stopped short when he saw the man on the floor, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "What's this?" he asked, his voice rough as gravel. "Found him half buried out there," Clara said, not looking up as she tucked the blanket tighter around the stranger. "He'd have frozen if I left him." Henry snorted, kicking the door shut behind him. "Should have left him. Strangers mean trouble, Clara, you know that." She straightened up, brushing her hands on her pants. "I'm not letting someone die just because I don't know him, Uncle Henry. He's hurt bad, arms cut up, and he's been out in the cold too long." Henry grumbled something under his breath, stomping over to the fire to warm his hands. "Your soft heart's gonna get us killed one day," he said. But he didn't push it. He never did. Clara just rolled her eyes and turned back to John, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. He was alive, and that was enough for now. It took hours before he showed any sign of waking. Clara stayed close, mending a tear in her jacket by the fire while Henry dozed in his chair. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but inside it was warm, the air thick with the smell of pine and smoke. Then, a low groan broke the quiet. Clara's head snapped up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. John's eyelids fluttered, and slowly those deep brown eyes opened, hazy and unfocused. "Hey," she said, setting her sewing aside and leaning closer. "You with me?" He blinked, his gaze darting around the cabin, taking in the rough walls, the fire, her face, before settling on her. Where am I?" His voice was rough, cracked from the cold, but there was a steadiness to it, a low timbre that didn't fit the wildness of this place. "My cabin," Clara said, keeping her tone even. "Found you half dead in the snow. You got a name?" He frowned, rubbing a hand over his face like he was trying to shake off a bad dream. I don't know," he said finally, his brow creasing. "It's all fuzzy." Clara raised an eyebrow, but didn't press him. Amnesia, maybe, or just shock from nearly freezing to death. "All right, John," she said, deciding to stick with the name for now. "You're safe here. Just rest." He nodded weakly, his head sinking back against the rolled-up blanket she'd propped under him. Over the next few days, he drifted in and out, his strength creeping back bit by bit. Clara kept busy chopping wood, checking traps, but she couldn't help watching him. He wasn't like the folks she knew. His hands stayed soft even as he healed, and the way he talked, when he did, had a polish to it, like someone used to boardrooms, not backwoods. Once, when she caught him staring at the fire, he muttered something about a car, a sleek black thing flashing through his mind, but then he shook his head like it slipped away. Henry didn't like it. "He's trouble," he said one night, his voice low as they sat at the rickety table, eating stew from wooden bowls. "Fancy clothes, no memory? He's running from something, or someone." "Maybe," Clara said, spooning up a bite of venison, "but he's not hurting anyone now. And he's trying." Trying was right. John started pitching in, small things at first, stacking firewood she'd chopped, stirring the pot when she cooked. He was clumsy as hell, nearly dropping a log on his foot once, and the first time he tried to stoke the fire, the whole cabin filled with smoke. Clara had to bite back a laugh as he coughed and waved it away, his face red. "Not used to this, huh?" she teased. He gave her a sheepish grin, the first real one she'd seen. "Guess not. Where I'm from, fire comes with a button." She smirked. "City boy then." He didn't deny it, just shrugged and went back to poking at the logs. There was something about him, something that didn't fit, like a puzzle piece jammed into the wrong spot. But he wasn't lazy, and he didn't complain, even when his hands blistered from hauling water or his bad arm ached in the cold. Clara caught herself watching him more than she meant to, noting the way his jaw tightened when he was frustrated, or how his eyes softened when he thanked her for the food. Henry was right about one thing. John was a stranger, but trouble? She wasn't so sure. One afternoon, she handed him a bucket. "Come with me to the stream," she said. "You're strong enough now." He hesitated, then nodded, pulling on the old coat she dug out of Henry's trunk. They stepped outside, the snow crunching under their boots, the air so cold it burned her lungs. John followed her down the path, quieter than usual, his breath fogging in the stillness. At the stream, she knelt to fill the bucket, the icy water numbing her fingers. He crouched beside her, watching her work. "You do this every day?" he asked, his voice low. "Most days," she said, not looking up. "Gotta eat, gotta stay warm. It's life out here." He didn't say anything for a minute, just stared at the water rushing over the rocks. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "I don't think I've ever had to fight for anything like this." Clara glanced at him, catching the shadow that crossed his face. "Wherever you're from," she said, "sounds a hell of a lot easier than here." He let out a dry laugh. "Maybe, or maybe it's just different." She didn't push him. Not yet. But as they hauled the water back to the cabin, the bucket swinging between them, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he was running from, or forgetting, was bigger than either of them knew. The night was quiet, save for the steady crackle of the fire and the faint howl of the wind outside the cabin. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, sharpening her hunting knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of metal filling the small space. John, still John to her, for now, sat on the old blanket by the hearth, his knees pulled up, staring into the flames like they held some kind of answer. He'd been quieter than usual all day, his brow furrowed, his fingers twitching like he was chasing a thought he couldn't quite grab. Henry was already snoring in the corner, his chair creaking under his weight, leaving just the two of them awake in the dim light. Clara didn't say anything, just kept working the blade, letting the silence stretch. She'd learned over the weeks that pushing him didn't help. Whatever was locked up in that head of his would come out when it was ready. And then, out of nowhere, he sat up straighter, his eyes widening like something had clicked. "I remember," he said, his voice rough but steady, cutting through the quiet like a gunshot. Clara's hands stilled, the whetstone hovering over the knife. She looked up, meeting his gaze. His brown eyes were sharp now, alive, with something she hadn't seen before. "Remember what?" she asked, keeping her tone even, though her pulse kicked up a notch. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his dark hair. "My name's not John, it's Ethan. Ethan Marshall." He paused, like he was testing the weight of it, then kept going. I own a company, Marshall Dynamics. We build tech, AI, software mostly, out of Seattle." His words came faster now, tumbling out like he couldn't stop them. "I was here, in Montana, for a meeting. A big one, some deal that could have changed everything." Clara set the knife down, leaning forward slightly. "What kind of deal?" He exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "A new AI project, something we've been working on for years, Smart systems, the kind that could run whole industries. It's worth billions if it goes right. I came out here to meet a partner, someone who was supposed to lock it down with me. We were at this lodge, fancy place, up near the pass. I remember dinner, drinks, and then... He stopped, his hands clenching into fists. Then it's just cold. Snow, nothing. Clara watched him, piecing it together. "Someone left you out there," she said, her voice low. "That gash on your arm, it wasn't an accident, was it?" Ethan shook his head, his expression darkening. "No, I don't think so. I keep seeing flashes. Someone standing over me, a glass in my hand. I think I was drugged, and I think I know who did it." She raised an eyebrow, waiting. He met her eyes, his voice dropping to a growl. "Victor Lane, my best friend, co-founder of the company. He's the only one who knew where I'd be, who had access to everything. If I was gone, he'd get it all. The deal, the company, the whole damn thing." Clara leaned back, crossing her arms. "So your buddy tried to kill you for a paycheck? That's cold." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, that's the world I come from. Trust someone too long and they stick a knife in your back, or leave you to freeze." She studied him for a long moment, the firelight flickering over his face. He looked different now, sharper, like the pieces of who he'd been were snapping back into place. But there was something else too. Anger, yeah, but also a kind of exhaustion, like he was tired of that world he'd just described. She couldn't blame him. It sounded like a hell of a lot of noise for nothing. "Billions, huh?" she said finally, picking up her knife again and running the stone along the edge. "That's a lot of money to leave someone for dead over." He nodded, staring at the floor. "It's not just the money. It's power, control. Victor always wanted more of it. I should have seen it coming." Clara shrugged, her voice dry. "Doesn't matter how much it's worth out there. Money didn't keep you alive in that snow. I did." Ethan looked up at her, startled, like her words had hit him square in the chest. For a second, he didn't say anything, just held her gaze. Then a small, crooked smile tugged at his lips. "You're right," he said softly. "Guess I owe you more than I can ever pay back." She snorted, brushing it off. "Don't get sappy on me, city boy. I didn't drag you in here for a thank you note." He chuckled, the sound rough but real, and it eased the tension in the air, but Clara could see it in his eyes. He wasn't done wrestling with this. Whatever Victor had done, it wasn't just a betrayal. It was a wound, one that went deeper than the cut on his arm. She'd seen that look before, in hunters who'd lost a season's worth of game, or folks who'd had their trust broken by someone they'd counted on. It wasn't her business, not really, but she couldn't help wondering what he'd do about it. "So what now?" she asked, setting the knife aside and resting her hands on her knees. "You gonna sit here feeling sorry for yourself, or you got a plan?" Ethan's smile faded, replaced by something harder, more determined. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I can't let him get away with it, not after this." Clara nodded, not surprised. She didn't care much for his world of suits and skyscrapers, but she understood revenge. Out here, you didn't let a wolf take your kill and walk away. You tracked it down, made it pay. Maybe his mountains were made of glass and steel, but the rules weren't so different. "Well," she said, standing up and stretching her arms over her head, "you're not going anywhere tonight. Storm's still raging, and that arm of yours isn't ready for a fight. Rest up, figure it out tomorrow." He watched her as she moved to the small table, grabbing a tin cup to pour herself some water. "You don't care, do you?" he said, almost like he couldn't believe it. "That I'm worth a fortune, that I run a company, it doesn't faze you at all." She took a sip, glancing at him over the rim. "Nope. Out here, all that matters is your breathing. Money doesn't light the fire, Ethan. It doesn't fill your belly, and it sure as hell didn't save you from that storm." He stared at her, like he was seeing her for the first time, and then he laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that echoed off the cabin walls. "Fair enough," he said, shaking his head. "Fair enough." Clara turned away to hide the faint smirk tugging at her lips. He was still a stranger, still a city boy with a past she didn't fully trust. But something about him was starting to grow on her, whether she liked it or not. The days stretched on in the cabin, each one blending into the next with the steady rhythm of survival. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick blanket of snow that glittered under the weak winter sun. Clara kept busy, checking her traps, hauling firewood, sharpening her arrows, her hands always moving, her mind focused on the next task. Ethan was stronger now, his arm healing into a jagged scar that he'd flex and wince at when he thought she wasn't looking. He wasn't the same man she'd dragged in from the cold, though. Something had shifted in him since that night by the fire, like the weight of who he'd been was starting to peel away. She didn't ask him much about Seattle or his company after that first talk. Didn't seem to matter out here, where the world was just trees and wind and the occasional growl of a hungry animal. But Ethan, he started asking her things. Small stuff at first, like how she'd learned to track deer or why she stayed in these mountains when she could have left for an easier life. She'd shrug, give him short answers. Grew up doing it, she'd say. Or town's too loud. I like it here. He'd nod, watching her with those deep brown eyes, like he was trying to figure her out. One morning, she decided he'd been idle long enough. "You're coming with me," she said, tossing him the old wool coat from Henry's trunk. "Time you learned something useful." He caught it, raising an eyebrow. "What, chopping wood's not enough?" "Nope," she said, slinging her bow over her shoulder. "You're gonna shoot. Let's see if those soft hands of yours can handle a bow." He smirked, pulling the coat on. "I've handled worse." She doubted that, but she didn't say it. They trekked out into the woods, the snow crunching under their boots, the air sharp and clean. At a small clearing, she handed him her spare bow, a simple thing, worn smooth from years of use, and showed him how to hold it, her calloused fingers brushing his as she adjusted his grip. "Pull back slow," she said, stepping back. "Aim for that pine over there. And don't shoot me." He laughed under his breath, lining up the shot. The first arrow went wide, thunking into a snowbank nowhere near the tree. Clara bit her lip to keep from grinning. "Try again," she said. "Less thinking, more doing." It took him a dozen tries, arrows flying everywhere but the target, before he finally nicked the edge of the trunk. He let out a triumphant whoop, turning to her with a grin that lit up his whole face. "See that? I'm a natural." "Sure," she said, smirking. "A natural disaster, maybe." He laughed, and she couldn't help laughing too, the sound echoing through the trees. It felt good, lighter than she'd expected, and for a minute, she forgot he didn't belong here. Over the next few days, she kept him at it, teaching him to set snares, to spot tracks in the snow, to listen for the rustle of something moving through the brush. He was terrible at first, stepping on every twig, fumbling with the rope until it tangled around his hands. But he didn't quit, even when his fingers turned red from the cold, or he tripped into a drift and came up sputtering. Clara watched him, surprised by how hard he tried. Most folks would have given up, gone back to whining about their warm beds and fancy drinks. Not Ethan. One afternoon, they were out checking a snare when the air went still. Too still. Clara froze, her hand on her knife, ears straining. Ethan opened his mouth to ask something, but she held up a finger, silencing him. Then she heard it. A low growl, deep and close. A wolf stepped out from the trees, its gray fur bristling, yellow eyes locked on them. Ethan stiffened beside her, his breath catching. "Don't move," she whispered, easing an arrow onto her bowstring. The wolf took a step forward, lips curling back over its teeth. Clara's heart pounded, but her hand stayed steady. She drew back and fired, not at the wolf, but into the snow a few feet away. The arrow hit with a sharp thud, kicking up a spray of white, and the wolf flinched, ears flattening. It hesitated, then turned and bolted back into the trees. Ethan let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling. "Holy hell," he muttered. "That was close," Clara finished, lowering her bow. She glanced at him, saw the way he was clutching the knife she'd given him, like he'd been ready to jump in. "You okay?" He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, thanks to you." She shrugged, brushing it off, but something warm flickered in her chest. He'd been scared, anyone would have been, but he hadn't run. He'd stayed, right there with her. That night, back in the cabin, they sat by the fire, the quiet settling around them like a blanket. Henry was out checking his own traps, leaving them alone. Ethan poked at the logs with a stick, the flames dancing in his eyes. "You've saved my life twice now," he said, his voice low. "Out there, in the snow, and today." "Don't keep score," she said, leaning back against the wall. "Just how it goes out here." He looked at her, his expression softening. "Maybe, but where I'm from, no one does that, not without wanting something back." She met his gaze, her stomach tightening at the way he said it. Like he was seeing her, really seeing her, past the dirt and the toughness. "Well," she said, keeping her voice light, "you're not there anymore, are you?" He smiled, small and real. "No, and I'm starting to think that's a good thing." She didn't say anything, just nodded and turned her eyes to the fire, but inside something shifted. She'd spent her whole life keeping people at arm's length. Henry was family, sure, but even he didn't get too close. Ethan, though, he was different. He didn't fit here with his soft hands and city talk, but he was trying to, and the more he did, the harder it got to pretend she didn't notice the way he looked at her, or the way her pulse jumped when he laughed. The next morning, she caught him staring out the window at the mountains, his face thoughtful. "What's on your mind, city boy?" she asked, slinging her quiver over her shoulder. He turned to her, his eyes distant. "Just thinking about how empty it all was," he said. "Back there, Seattle, the company, all of it. I had everything, and it didn't mean a damn thing when I was lying in that snow." Clara paused, her hand on the door. "And now?" He hesitated, then met her gaze. "Now I'm starting to see what does." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and stepped outside, letting the cold air hit her face. But his words stuck with her, burrowing deep, and as they headed into the woods together, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was growing between them was something she hadn't been ready for and wasn't sure she could stop. The sun was dipping low over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and shadow, when trouble came knocking. Clara was outside the cabin, splitting firewood with sharp, practiced swings of her axe. Ethan stood nearby, stacking the logs she'd cut, his breath puffing out in the crisp air. He'd gotten better at it, his hands weren't as clumsy anymore, and he'd stopped dropping every other piece. She'd caught herself watching him more than once, the way his shoulders moved under Henry's old coat, the quiet focus in his eyes. It was stupid, she told herself, letting her guard down like that, but it was hard not to. The sound hit her first, boots crunching through the snow, too heavy, too deliberate to be Henry coming back from his traps. Clara's axe froze mid-swing, her head snapping up. 3 men emerged from the trees, their dark coats stark against the white landscape. They weren't locals, she could tell from the way they moved, stiff and out of place, like they didn't know these woods. One carried a rifle slung over his shoulder, another had a flashlight dangling from his belt, its beam cutting through the fading light. The third, a stocky guy with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward, his eyes locking on Ethan. "Ethan Marshall," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Been looking for you." Clara's stomach dropped. She lowered the axe, gripping it tight, her knuckles whitening. Ethan went still beside her, the log in his hands falling to the snow with a soft thud. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with something sharp. The scarred man smirked, ignoring the question. "You're a hard guy to kill, you know that? Thought the cold would have finished you off by now." Ethan's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists. "Victor sent you," he said, not a question. "He wants to make sure I don't come back." The man shrugged, like it didn't matter either way. "Boss says you're a loose end. Loose ends get tied up." He nodded to the guy with the rifle, who raised it slowly, the barrel glinting in the dusk. Clara didn't think, she acted. "Ethan, run!" she shouted, grabbing his arm and yanking him toward the trees. A shot cracked through the air, splintering the woodpile where he'd been standing a second ago. Her heart slammed against her ribs as they bolted, the snow dragging at their boots. The men shouted behind them, their footsteps pounding closer, but Clara knew these woods like her own skin. She pulled Ethan hard to the left, ducking under low branches, weaving through the pines. "Keep moving," she hissed, her breath burning in her lungs. Ethan stumbled but didn't stop, his hand gripping hers tight. The forest blurred around them, snow kicking up in their wake, branches snapping as they tore through. Another shot rang out too close, and Clara veered right, dragging him toward a frozen creek she'd crossed 100 times. The ice glistened under the last of the light, thin but solid enough if they were quick. "Cross it," she said, shoving him ahead. He hesitated, glancing at the dark water beneath, but she didn't give him time to argue. Now. He stepped onto the ice, sliding a little, and she followed, her boots skidding as she kept low. The ice groaned under their weight but held, and they made it to the other side just as the men burst through the trees behind them. Clara didn't look back. She grabbed a handful of loose stones from the bank and hurled them into the brush to the left, the clatter echoing through the stillness. "Over there!" one of the men yelled, and she heard them crash off in the wrong direction. It wouldn't fool them long, but it was enough. She pulled Ethan down behind a fallen log, pressing herself against the rough bark, her chest heaving. He crouched beside her, his breath ragged, his eyes wild but focused. "They're gonna keep coming," he whispered, his voice tight. "They won't stop until I'm dead." Clara peeked over the log, scanning the trees. The men's voices were fainter now, moving away, but she knew he was right. Whoever this Victor was, he'd sent killers, not amateurs. She turned to Ethan, her mind racing. "Then we don't give them the chance," she said. "We've got to get you out of here." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I can't run forever, Clara. I have to go back to Seattle, face him, end this." She stared at him, the cold seeping through her jacket, her pulse still hammering. "You'll be walking into a trap," she said. "You know that, right?" "Maybe," he said, meeting her eyes. "But if I don't, they'll find me anyway. And you and Henry, they'll come after you too. I can't let that happen." Her throat tightened at that, a flicker of something she didn't want to name. He was right, damn it. These weren't the kind of men who'd just shrug and go home. They'd burn the cabin down, hunt her and Henry like animals, all to get to him. She hated it, hated that his world had crashed into hers, dragging this mess with it. But she couldn't argue with the look in his eyes, the hard set of his mouth. He wasn't asking her permission, he was telling her. "Fine," she said finally, her voice low. "But you're not going alone. I'm coming with you." His brows shot up. "Clara, no, you don't have to." "Shut up," she cut him off, her tone sharp. "You don't know how to fight these people, not out there. I do. I've tracked wolves, dodged bears. I can handle a few city bastards with guns. You need me." He stared at her, something softening in his face, like he wanted to argue but knew she'd already made up her mind. "Okay," he said at last, his voice quieter. "But we've got to move fast. They'll circle back." She nodded, pushing herself up from the snow. "Then let's go. We'll head to the ridge. There's a trail Henry uses to get to town. We can figure out the rest from there." Ethan stood, brushing snow off his coat, and for a moment they just looked at each other, the hunter and the hunted, thrown together by chance and now bound by something neither of them could name. Then she turned, leading the way into the darkening woods, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and fire. Whatever came next, she wasn't letting him face it alone. The journey to Seattle was a blur of gritted teeth and stolen moments. Clara and Ethan slipped away from the mountains under cover of darkness, hitching a ride with a grizzled trucker Henry knew in town. The man didn't ask questions, just grunted and let them pile into the cab, the hum of the engine drowning out the tension between them. Clara kept her bow close, her knife tucked into her boot, her eyes scanning every shadow like a hawk. Ethan sat beside her, quieter than she'd ever seen him, his hands clenched in his lap as the miles rolled by. She could tell he was turning it all over in his head. Victor, the betrayal, what he'd do when he got there. She didn't push him. There'd be time for that later. By the time they hit Seattle, the city hit her like a punch. Towering buildings, lights that burned her eyes, the endless roar of cars and people. It was nothing like her mountains, and she hated it instantly. Ethan led her through the chaos, his steps sure despite the weeks he'd spent away. They ended up at a sleek glass skyscraper, the headquarters of Marshall Dynamics, its name glowing in sharp neon letters. Inside, it was all polished floors and hushed voices, people in suits staring at her faded jacket and muddy boots like she'd wandered in from another planet. She didn't care. She was here for Ethan, not them. He'd timed it perfectly. A board meeting, the whole company gathered in a room of glass and steel. Clara stayed back, leaning against the wall near the door, her arms crossed as Ethan strode in, his borrowed coat swapped for a borrowed suit from some assistant who'd nearly fainted at the sight of him alive. The room went dead silent when he walked in, a dozen faces turning, some shocked, some pale, one smug. Victor Lane sat at the head of the table, a lean man with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, damn," Victor said, leaning back in his chair. "You're tougher than I thought, Ethan." Ethan didn't flinch, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You tried to kill me, Victor. Drugged me, dumped me in the middle of nowhere. Thought you'd take it all, didn't you?" Victor chuckled, spreading his hands. "Come on, man. You're talking crazy. I've been holding this place together while you were, what, lost in the woods?" Clara watched Ethan's fists tighten, his shoulders rigid. "I've got proof," he said. "The lodge's security footage, your face, your car, and the men you sent after me in Montana. One of them talked. It's over." The room shifted, murmurs rippling through the suits. Victor's smile faltered, just for a second, and then he laughed, a loud barking sound that made Clara's skin crawl. "Proof? You think that matters? You're not the only one with cards to play, Ethan. Tell him, Lydia." Clara's eyes snapped to the woman sitting near Victor, one she hadn't noticed until now. She was younger than Ethan, maybe late 20s, with the same sharp jaw and dark hair, but her eyes were colder, harder. She stood, smoothing her tailored blazer, and the pieces clicked into place before Ethan even spoke. "Lydia," he said, his voice cracking. "What the hell's he talking about?" Lydia Marshall, his sister, stepped forward, her heels clicking on the floor. "Victor didn't plan this, Ethan," she said, her tone smooth as ice. "I did. He was just the muscle. You've had everything. Dad's trust, the company, the spotlight, and I got scraps. I was done waiting." Ethan stared at her, his face draining of color. You set me up? My own sister?" She shrugged, like it was nothing. "Business isn't family, Ethan. You taught me that. I hired the men, spiked your drink, told them where to leave you. Victor was supposed to take the fall if it went south, but you..." she smirked, glancing at Clara. You found yourself a guardian angel, didn't you? Clara's blood boiled, her hand itching for her knife, but she stayed still, watching Ethan. He looked like he'd been gutted, his hands shaking as he stepped closer to Lydia. Why? He rasped. I gave you everything. Shares, a seat on the board. Why this? Because it wasn't enough, Lydia snapped, her cool mask slipping. I wanted it all, and with you gone, I'd have it. The room erupted, board members shouting, security moving in, but Ethan didn't wait. He turned to the suits, his voice rising over the chaos. I've got the evidence, the footage, the confession. It's all with my lawyer, ready to go public. Lydia's done. And Victor? You're finished, too. Lydia lunged forward, her face twisting, but two guards grabbed her arms, pulling her back. Victor bolted for the door, only to find Clara blocking it, her stance wide, her eyes daring him to try her. He froze, hands up, and she gave him a cold smile. Not today, she said. It was over fast after that. Lydia and Victor were hauled out, the board scrambling to save face. Ethan stood in the middle of it, breathing hard, his world crumbling and rebuilding all at once. When the room finally cleared, he turned to Clara, his eyes raw. I didn't see that coming, he admitted, his voice hoarse. My own sister. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. People do ugly things for power. You couldn't have known. He nodded, but the hurt lingered, etched into his face. Then he straightened, a new resolve settling in. I'm done here, he said. I'm stepping down. Let someone else run this circus. I don't want it anymore. Clara blinked, surprised. You sure? This is your life. Not anymore, he said, his gaze locking on hers. I found something better. Her chest tightened, a mix of warmth and uncertainty swirling inside her. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, letting the weight of his words hang between them. Seattle wasn't her place, and he knew it, but what came next, wherever it led, she had a feeling they'd figure it out together. The mountains of Montana welcomed them back like an old friend, the air sharp with pine and frost, the silence a balm after Seattle's chaos. Clara stood outside the cabin, her boots sinking into the fresh snow, her breath fogging in the cold. Ethan was beside her, unloading a sack of supplies from the sled they'd borrowed in town. He traded his borrowed suit for a thick wool coat, his hands rougher now, marked by the weeks he'd spent learning her world. The city was behind him, Lydia in custody, Victor facing charges. Martial dynamics handed off to some eager exec who'd jumped at the chance. He'd walked away from it all, and he hadn't looked back. She'd been skeptical when he said he was coming with her. You'll miss your fancy coffee, she'd teased on the ride back, half expecting him to change his mind. But he just smiled, that quiet, steady smile she'd come to know, and said, I'll figure out how to live without it. And damn if he didn't mean it. The first few days were slow, settling into a rhythm. He helped her rebuild the woodpile those men had shot up, his swings with the axe surer now, the blade biting deep into the logs. She showed him how to patch the cabin's roof, the two of them balanced on the rickety ladder, laughing when he nearly slipped and she caught his arm. Henry grumbled about city boys sticking around, but Clara caught the old man slipping Ethan an extra piece of venison at dinner, a grudging nod of approval. One evening, Ethan came back from town with a plan. They sat by the fire, the cabin warm and snug, as he spread out a rough sketch on the table. I've got money left, he said, his voice low but firm. Not all of it, but enough. I want to build something here. A community center. Nothing big, just a place for folks to get supplies, see a doctor, maybe learn a trade, stuff people out here need. Clara looked at him, the firelight catching the determination in his eyes. You're serious, she said, not a question. Yeah, he said. You saved me, Clara, not just from the snow, but from everything. I want to give something back. She didn't say anything for a moment, just studied him, the man who'd stumbled into her life half dead, who'd fought his way out of betrayal and come out the other side. "All right," she said finally, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But don't expect me to wear a dress for the grand opening." He laughed, and it was the best sound she'd heard in a long time. Weeks later, they stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, the sky ablaze with stars. The wind was cold, but Ethan's hand found hers, warm and steady, and she didn't pull away. "Can I stay?" he asked, his voice soft but sure, like he'd been holding the question for a while. She turned to him, her heart thumping in a way she wasn't used to. He wasn't the lost stranger anymore, or the billionaire running from his past. He was just Ethan, hers, if she'd let him be. "Yeah," she said, squeezing his hand. "You can stay." The stars shimmered above, endless and bright, and as they stood there side by side, Clara knew this was home. Not just the mountains, but him. Together they'd built something real, something that mattered, and that was enough.